able to introduce Deborah Jarchow, whom I'm sure most of you know, and she is one of our members. Great, great weaving teacher, who was originally scheduled to do this talk and workshop in March of 2020. So very happy to finally be able to have it. Before I turn things over to Deborah, I do want to plug her book, which I think she'll mention a little bit, and you can order it on our Amazon affiliates page. I was looking at that page and it's a bit out of date. It says, we really hope can have Deborah who had to get canceled. So, but anyway, it's a really fun book with lots of interesting ideas for off loom weaving, and I hope she'll talk a little bit about it. But the focus of her talk today and of the workshop that follows this afternoon and tomorrow is rigid heddle weaving. So, Deborah, please take it away.
It's really nice to be here and see so many familiar faces. In October, we moved to Arizona, and so I've only been back to California a couple of times, and I don't get to see a lot of people while I'm there, so it's nice to see you all online. And my talk today is on what can you make on a rigid heddle loom. For many years, as many of you might know, I was a production weaver, and I sat at my looms all day and wove yards and yards of fabric, and I made garments and accessories that I sold to, I don't know, I think at one point it was 10 galleries around the country. And I had at one time 9 floor looms that I used because I would set each one up for a different type of project that I was weaving. So they were all, like I would have the chenille scarves on one loom and the ruanas on another loom. And that way I could just tie on to the threading that I had. And my looms ranged from 20 inches, and I had one that was 6 feet wide. So lots of looms. Now I'm down to 1 floor loom, but I probably have 30 rigid heddle looms. So there you go. It's changed quite a bit. At the time I was a production weaver, if somebody would have asked me about a rigid heddle loom, I probably would have said something like, oh, those are toys and I'm a real weaver. I still run into that attitude a lot. But I have come to really respect the rigid heddle loom, and I can make all kinds of things on it. And I just love the fact that they're so versatile. So you can make lots of things on the rigid heddle loom that most people think you can only make on a floor loom. And to me, the essence of that kind of attitude is I was teaching at a conference on the East Coast, and I was teaching double weave on the rigid heddle loom. It was a 3-day workshop or something. And they, at that particular conference, they have a open house evening where anybody attending the conference can walk around to every classroom and see what people are working on and, get an idea of what that class is doing. And a group of women came into my classroom, and there was obviously one lady that was kind of the leader of the group, the expert on weaving, and she was showing the others all kinds of things. And they walked in, and I kind of thought, well, maybe I'm invisible. I don't know. I'm standing here. And she was saying, now this workshop is billed as double weaving on the rigid heddle loom, but it's not really, because you can't do double weave on a rigid heddle loom. And I was like, yes, you can. And so I was showing her the samples of the 2 layers of cloth and, weaving a tube and all sorts of things. And she just kept insisting, but it's not real weaving it's not real double weave on a rigid heddle loom because you can't do it. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I can't change your mind. So I kind of feel like it's my mission. Part of my mission in life now is to educate people that rigid heddles are really cool little looms, and you can do lots of stuff on them. So anyway, I'll stop chit-chatting about all of that and do a presentation on different things that you can do on a rigid heddle loom. So, and I hope to help some people feel like, you know, they're really a wonderful tool that you can use. So I'm going to share my screen now and pull up my presentation, share, and play. And so, so I'm on everybody's screen now with the full screen. Okay, now I will say, I know Virginia asked you to mute yourselves, but I kind of like an interactive discussion. So if you have a question, please call out the question while we're there. I know I don't think I can see the chat on my screen at this point. So just, if you have a question, just ask it and I'd be happy to address it. That way we can talk about it when we're right there. Okay. So rigid heddle loom. Here's a couple of rigid heddle looms. These are both Ashfords. The first one in the front is an Ashford sample it loom, and then the other one is what's called the knitter's loom. And just a little interesting tidbit about the knitter's loom. It was the first loom that the design of rigid heddle looms, which have been around for ages, it was the first piece or loom that was redesigned to become friendly with knitting yarns. The holes were made bigger. That design on that particular loom was made so it folds, so it fits in a bag and you can carry it around. And knitters were their target market. They were trying to get knitters into weaving. And so they designed this loom and they called it the knitter's loom to appeal to their market. So it's a very popular loom. There are quite a few looms on the market now that fold and are friendly for knitting yarn. And I'm using quotes when I say knitting yarn. So anyway, that's why it's called the knitter's loom. So you can see they're very simple. They're small, although you can get one as wide as 48 inches, a rigid heddle loom, but they're very easy to use. So I just want to show some things. The first picture here is from class, and this is students' work. All of these people, I think most of the people in this class were first-time rigid heddle users or even first-time beginning weavers. And these are the projects they made in a one-day class. So it's very exciting to me as a teacher that people can begin weaving and make something in a class in one day and walk away with a finished product. Now, Virginia, I can see that there are seven things. Oh, it's 7 things in the chat. Okay, but I can't read them while I'm talking. So if there's something that somebody, you know, a comment, can you call out?
I will.
Okay.
But these are just like somebody arrived and
okay. All right,
yeah.
Good. Thank you. Okay. So this is a scarf just showing how you can make something really interesting looking, just using simple plain weave and on a rigid heddle loom as a beginner project. This is using a variegated yarn. And if Bonnie is still online, she might recognize this. This was one of the scarves we made on a cruise that Bonnie and I were on. So that was kind of fun. Oh, and I've numbered the slides. I just wanted to mention that. I've numbered the slides, and a lot of these pieces I have patterns for. So if you write down the number of the slide, if you're interested in anything, I have a document that tells you where you can find the pattern, and a lot of them, how much yarn and what kind of yarn you need to make that piece. Here's, again, a simple scarf with stripes. This is a warp-faced scarf. You see mostly the warp. I used a very tiny weft yarn that is very sparkly. So the scarf has a lot of sparkle to it, and it was done in the weft. This is, again, another piece that somebody could make that's a very beginning weaver and have a very successful project. This is a bag, and I can't remember if this was in handwoven or little looms. actually it was in Little Looms in 2016. It's a Weft Face Bag. This is one of the things that I love about rigid heddle looms is that it's so easy to use, and I'm using quotes, knitting yarns to weave with. This is self-patterning sock yarn as the weft. I used 10-2 cotton, or actually I think it was a ball of cotton that I bought at one of the big box stores that was crochet cotton, because I was trying to make the project more accessible to people that aren't into weaving or don't have a weaving store near them. So the warp is a very thin cotton. The weft is the self-patterning sock yarn, and the yarn does all of the work in this. Where because I teach a lot of beginners, one of my mantra is beat is the term, it's not the action, because you don't want to beat too hard when you're making a scarf or a garment. But on this one, you beat really hard, so it's a really good beginner project. This piece actually, I believe it was 45 picks per inch in weaving to really get that dense fabric to make a nice sturdy bag. And on this particular one, I needle wove the warp ends into the weft. I didn't want to have a hem on the bag. It's just needle woven back in. And I love going to thrift stores. The pieces on here were from a necklace in a thrift store. Here's another very simple project. This one was also in handwoven, and I believe this is their picture. It's three lengths of fabric seamed together to make a poncho. So you've got one long length, a second long length that goes over the shoulder and around the back, and a third long length that's then cut to give the opening for the poncho and the fold down collar in front and back. I like to, with the rigid heddle looms, I like using small looms. And so I love creating projects that you can make on a small loom, a garment or something bigger where you can sew things together and make bigger pieces. Here's a couple of bags, and let's see. I think these were in Little Looms also. These are the same pattern. The one on the left is, I used 2 different yarns in the warp, and then one of those yarns as the weft, and this one is all silk. And I loved the difference in these 2 bags because they're just a long strip that you fold over. And this bag on the left is a much sturdier bag because I used thicker yarn. The bag on the right is all a beautiful silk that I got from Redfin Dye Works. Beautiful silk. It's a much lighter bag. You wouldn't want to put too many things in here because it's a very light silk fabric. But one of the things that I was featuring in these bags is that there's a kumihimo handle. So that's another technique that one can learn, and long twisted fringe with beads in the fringe, which is a fun thing to play with. This is a shawl and a bag that I was showing how using the same yarn can make totally different projects when it's combined with different things. The shawl is the same yarn, warp and weft, and that the yarn on that particular one, it's a really interesting, and again, I'm using quotes, knitting yarn, where it not only does the color change in the yarn, but the texture also changes. So all of that design in there is caused just by the yarn. It's not anything that the weaver does. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck by using interesting yarns. The bag that goes with it is a plain cotton warp. It's hand dyed, so it's got variation in the colors. But then the weft is the yarn that's used over here in the shawl. And once I got this one finished, I looked at it and I thought, I had these tassels down at the bottom, and I thought, it just needs something more than fringe here on the edges. So I added the tassels in to give it a little bit of pizzazz, and it's just kind of a fun piece. Mohair scarf. I had tried weaving mohair on a floor loom, and it was pesky. Because the mohair wants to stick together. I found that weaving mohair on a rigid heddle loom was much easier than on a floor loom. So, this is one woven on a loom. Again, the yarn choice is huge. This is a yarn that is 70% mohair and 30% silk, and it's a long color change yarn. So using it both as the warp and the weft gives interesting patterns. The key for this is not beating too hard, or you end up with a hairy mat. As opposed to a nice open weave. You can see this is a balanced weave structure where it's 8 ends per inch, and it's also 8 picks per inch. So when you're weaving it, it looks very flimsy, but by the time you get it done, it makes a wonderful, nice, lacy, drapey piece. And then here's shawls that are woven. I've done mohair shawls in 2 different ways. On a 20-inch wide loom, I can do the shawl as one piece, or I've also done them 10-inch wide panels and then stitch them together. So, and one thing I've found with mohair is I do like to put beads in the fringe to weight them down. Otherwise, the fringe just kind of flies away and becomes a static electricity sculpture. Almost.
Yeah.
I take it somebody else has experienced that. Okay, this is a project that was 2 projects on one loom. And so I wove the scarf, and then on the same warp, I used it. So this scarf, it actually has some of that mohair as the weft. And this one, I used one of the warp threads, slow color change. So you can see it's, again, the 10-inch wide panel. The scarf is 10 inches wide, 10-inch wide panel. And then I used the thicker yarn as the weft and beat it harder to give the consistency of the bag. And I sewed the 2 panels together. I used to think that when I sewed things together, I remember, younger sewing stripes or plaids, that they needed to be matched up perfectly, which is certainly important in some sorts of designs that you're doing. But with pieces like this, I like the variation of the 2 sides not matching completely. You can see that they're the same fabric, but I like that they're offset and they're different things. And for this particular project, I felt like the purchased leather handles added something to the design. So I used those instead of using hand woven handles. The next one, this is the same bag. On a 20-inch wide loom, I did the shawl. And I have the fabric to make the 20-inch wide bag, but I just haven't sewn it up yet. So I just put the picture of the 10-inch wide fabric bag here. So there you go. A project unfinished. These are some pillows that I made. This is differential shrinkage, again, on a rigid heddle loom. And the felting is a really great project to do on a rigid heddle loom, making small panels, because you can join 2 panels together and you don't even know there's a seam there. So the dark color, the black or the dark pink, both are the wool. And then this is a rayon cotton blend that's the variegated on both of them, so it doesn't felt. So I wove the 2 panels, 2 long panels, and then I stitched them together with using the wool yarn as thread. And then when I take them off the loom, after I take them out of the washing machine, the wool has felted and the rayon cotton hasn't. So it gives kind of a poofiness to those areas, and it it completely hides the stitching together to create wider panels. So those are kind of fun. Fun way to use small looms to create bigger pieces. This is a Fibonacci based sequence. The warp is Fibonacci stripes. So you can see they're wider on the sides, then they get smaller in the center, then they get wider again on the opposite side. And then the weft is also put in Fibonacci based, wider stripes, getting smaller, getting bigger again. And it's the one yarn is a slow color change yarn. This one is pink to green, and on here it's gray to light gray, matched with a solid color. And so it makes an interesting pattern. These were woven on a 20-inch wide loom. This is one of my favorite pieces that I did. I wove this on a 20-inch wide loom, although I have the pattern for weaving it on, weaving two 10-inch panels and then sewing them together. One long strip, fringe on one end, cut the fringe off the other end, and sew the end of the warp to the side of the piece at the beginning. So this particular one, the warp is mohair and a rayon yarn that's kind of a bouquet. And again, I would never have used this yarn, the one with the bouquet-ish, on my floor looms because of the construction of the yarn. It wouldn't have gone through the action with the heddles going up and down as much. So using a rigid heddle loom gives me the flexibility to use different yarns than I might use on my floor looms. Making little wall hangings. This is also a beginning class that I do, and these are some pieces that some participants in the class made. Just using fun yarns on a very narrow warp and beating hard and just playing with color and texture. These are some that I did, just using fun yarns, using up a lot of fun stuff. And then lately I've started teaching some classes using tapestry techniques on the rigid heddle loom and incorporating them into weaving that's not necessarily a tapestry like a scarf or a garment, incorporating those tapestry techniques into plain weaving. So these are some raya knots that you could always put at the ends of scarves. This is a combination of looping, twining, and sumac. Here I've got some looping down, I'm sorry, I've got some twining down here where I've twined and not all the way across, just kind of doing fun playing with the twining. Looping, using a knitting needle to loop around, smaller loops, bigger loops, more loops, even bigger. And then here I've got some sumac, doing different kinds of playing with sumac in different ways, which is really a lot of fun. Here's a close-up of the twining. So those are fun things you can do on a rigid heddle loom. And my personal feeling on doing techniques like this is when I was weaving on my floor looms, I would always feel like I wanted to move on and make the cloth. And I was less inclined to do techniques that took more manipulation like these do, because it felt like I was interfering with my weaving process. But on the rigid heddle loom, I love doing things like this because it just feels more immediate and more in front of me. I don't know, that could be a personal thing, but maybe other people feel that way also. Here's a wall hanging that I did incorporating a lot of those pieces. Raya knots here, clasp weft, looping, more clasp weft, a little bit more looping, clasp weft, color and weave patterns, and then raya knots at the top again. Actually, this is one of the projects that's going to be in my book that's coming out later this year on rigid heddle weaving. So be sure and look for that. Color and weave patterns are a lot of fun to do on the rigid heddle loom. This is a sampler class. This is a class that I do, making a sampler scarf, just experimenting with different color and weave patterns. Always fun to do on any kind of loom, whether it's a floor loom or a rigid heddle loom. There's lots you can do with it. And then these are some student projects from a class teaching that. So you can see all the different techniques that they checked out and learned in the class. And then here's a little bag that I made on a rigid heddle loom, color and weave techniques. In making this particular bag, I do 3 different patterns. So you can see there's one pattern on the bottom of the bag, then the side of the bag, and the fold over flaps on the bag. So you start off weaving this pattern, then you weave this one for a while, then this one, then you just go back with this one and the last one. So it's a fun project, and you know, is particularly good for people that are learning color weave patterns, because you have something besides a scarf when you finish with the class. And again, this is a Kumihimo handle that I put on here. And log cabin, certainly a color and weave favorite on the rigid heddle loom. It's very easy to do, and you can do all kinds of different log cabin patterns. This one is just basic blocks. And I love showing this picture because when Ashford first started making the knitter's loom, they had the blue plastic parts. They've switched to white and tan now, but this was one of in their first series that they made. I guess they got feedback that the blue made people think it was more of a toy than, you know, than a real thing. So they changed it to white and tan, which always makes me smile. Some more log cabin patterns on the rigid heddle loom, just playing around with log cabin, different widths of log cabin, different block sizes, and more block sizes, even blocks. This particular pattern makes a nice scarf or table runner because you've got the long section in the middle that is kind of plain, and the decorative log cabin patterns on the end. Plain weave, color gamp, always a fun thing. This is Clasped Weft project. The warp goes from side to side is actually the warp. And so the warp has 3 sections in it. It's color A on the sides, color B in the middle, color A on this side again. And then I did the clasp weft. This was done on a 20-inch wide loom. So this pillow is, I mean, it's a huge pillow. It's like 18 inches wide finished this way. And I don't know, golly, it's really, I'm thinking it's 36 inches wide. Actually, the pillow, it's like a sofa or a floor pillow. And that was fun. That one was also, I think, in hand woven. And clasped warp, always a fun technique. Became popular, I think, a couple of years ago. It's a lot easier to do clasp warp on a rigid heddle than it is on a harnessed loom. I'm not sure I've seen anybody do clasped warp on a harness loom, although I'm sure people have. But on the rigid heddle loom, it's very, very simple to do. And
Deborah,
yeah.
could you, for those who don't know, could you explain what clasp warp is?
I certainly can. You have one, thank you, Virginia. You have one kind of warp. You attach one kind of warp to the back warping rod. One color, like the black is attached to the back warping rod. And then you pull the loop through the heddle, and you have a different color warp attached to your warping peg, or if you're on I won't even go there, on a multi-harness loom, on a rigid heddle loom, you have a different kind of warp, a color of warp attached to your warping peg, and you pass you pass the one that's attached to the peg through the loop that's attached to the back warping rod, and then you go around the peg so that you have 2 threads through each slot and hole, and so that you have a different color warp on each end. I hope that explained it okay. And these are both student work from classes. I just taught this class yesterday, and lots of wonderful things come out of this class. Beautiful colors. This is a Clasped Warp shawl. It's 3 panels sewn together. So with the Clasped Warp, as I just explained, you have color A on one end and color B on the other end. So I made 3 panels on this. Pink was on one end and the blue-green variegated yarn was on the other end on all 3. So when I sewed the 3 panels together, I switched one so it's got color A on this end, color B here, color A here on this end, and just the opposite on the other end. So you can see the fringe hanging down here, that the fringe is pink on the sides and blue-green in the middle. And this was also a very lumpy, bumpy, the variegated blue-green yarn was a very lumpy, bumpy kind of yarn that I would not have felt comfortable using on a floor loom because of the stress going through the heddles and up and down so much, where it was much easier to use on a rigid heddle loom. And this piece I used a very thin mohair lace yarn, mohair silk yarn, lace weight for the weft, so that it's a very warped face piece. Getting into using pickup. Pickup, you use a pickup stick, which is what we're doing in the class this afternoon and tomorrow, and you use it to manipulate your warp thread so that you skip over or go under, and then you have warp threads or weft threads that float on top of the fabric. So this is a very simple pickup pattern that makes a zigzag. So for interest, I used a variegated yarn in the weft, and then the warp color shows up in the warp floats that are created by using pickup sticks. Fun technique. Lots of fun to do. And of course, on a multi-harness loom, you can thread your loom, so you can do things like this. But it's pretty simple on a rigid heddle loom also. This is more pickup. The ones on the left have a great story, which I'm sure Deanna will appreciate. I was approached by Ashford to do an article for Handwoven magazine. They were having an issue on different kinds of looms, and different looms, different uses, different specialties of different looms. And Ashford wanted me to do an article showing using the same pattern on an 8 harness loom and on a rigid heddle loom. So I did this huck pattern both on a rigid heddle loom using pickup sticks, and on my 8 harness loom, creating the pattern by my threading. And the thing that I thought was interesting about this was that of course I timed myself so that I could put it in the article, but the amount of time it took me to start the project from the time I got my rigid heddle loom out till I took the piece off of the loom was less time than it took me to thread my 8 harness loom. So, you know, I mean, it took me, of course, longer to weave on the rigid heddle loom than it took me to weave on the multi-harness loom, but the total time involved in the project was half the time on the rigid heddle loom than it was on the multi-harness loom. And I mentioned Deanna on this one because she was the tech editor, and Handwoven didn't want it to be an 8 harness pattern, so she rewrote the pattern for 4 harness, translating it from 8 harness, and I'm sure that was a tedious job to do, Deanna, so thank you for doing that. Anyway, and then here is just a shawl showing you know, the pattern using a shawl. And this particular one over here on the right is one that also will be in my Rigid Heddle book coming out later this year. And then there's Brooks Bouquet, which is a really fun technique. And as I mentioned before, I enjoy doing hand manipulation patterns more on my Rigid Heddle loom than I ever did on my multi-harness loom. So Brooks Bouquet is just where you wrap some of the warp threads with the weft as you move across the loom. And here I've done 3 wraps around each group of warp threads. Over here, I've wrapped once, but I've inserted a bead on top of the wrap, and just fun things playing with the loom.
Deborah, may I ask a question?
Please do.
Sorry, can you go back to slide 33?
I can.
So the colorful projects on the left, are you showing multi-harness and rigid heddle?
Yes, and the interesting,
okay, got it.
I
didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah, I made 2 scarves exactly with the same yarn.
Got it. So the top one is the harness, and the bottom underneath that is the rigid heddle.
Right. And when I sent them to Handwoven, I had them tagged. This is the rigid heddle one, and this is the multi-harness one. Okay. And they have to take the tags off to take the photographs. And so when I got them back, I can't tell them apart. I can't tell which I wove on which loom.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maureen, you have a question?
No?
I have to unmute. What's the width of the knitter's loom that you recommend?
That's a whole discussion. I don't personally, now people have really big rigid heddle looms. I personally don't like weaving on a rigid heddle loom that's wider than 20 inches or maybe 24, because one of the things I find appealing about them is that they're small and they're right there, and I can, it's an easier, comfortable thing to sit at my rigid heddle loom than when I sit at my multi-harness loom that's real big. I like the smallness of it. So for me, a 20 to 24 inches is the biggest that I like. I love my 12-inch knitter's loom, and I probably use that one a lot more than I use my 20-inch knitter's loom, but the 20-inch certainly comes in handy sometimes. So it depends on what you want to make on your looms. And what's going to be better for you. With the 20-inch, you probably want a stand, or you want a nice table that you can lean it up against. The 12-inch, I'll often sit with it on my lap and weave. And that's part of why I enjoy the small looms so much, is because I like having it sit on my lap while I watch TV and I'm sitting on the couch. That gives you a little window into what I like.
Now, is that what you use for your classes? Is that what
yes, all my classes, you can use a 10-inch wide loom.
Okay.
And I probably weave on the 10-inch wide looms more than anything. As I look around here, I'm teaching 4 different classes this week. And as I look around, the looms that I have warped up for the classes are all 10-inch wide looms. So,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Okay, then here's some Leno. These are very simple Leno scarves. They're very plain scarves, all plain weave, except that the Leno adds a little bit of pizzazz. So, it's just a fun technique. Leno is where you twist your warp threads and run your weft through so that it holds the twist in place. Here's more Leno, some dish towels. Where I use the Leno to accent the color stripes in the towels. Another Leno bag, and I think this one was in Little Looms a while ago. I think so. I'm not absolutely positive. Anyway, using the Leno to accentuate the color stripes again, but not weaving Leno all the way across, only weaving it part way. I wove this one as a market bag, like that you would take to the farmer's market with you, that you could put your goods in. And I thought it was a nice idea that it would have breathing room in it, so that, you know, you don't, like your plastic bags always kind of sweat a little when you take them to, or when you get your fruit in your plastic bag. So I like the idea of them having a little breathing space. This is Windowpane, another form of pickup. The warp is threaded so that the black will accentuate the blocks. And then the weft, when I put it in, I also put black in on the areas to accentuate the blocks, or the window panes as well. Another pickup technique, a lace pickup, where you've got both warp, let's see, warp and weft floats to create the pattern. A shawl made using lots of pickup. Well, actually, it's only 3 different pickup techniques. So one pickup pattern on both ends, and then a different pickup pattern that goes around the shoulders. On this particular project, I crocheted the edges with a lace kind of crochet so that it could act also as buttonholes. And this particular piece is like 3 garments in one. It can be a shawl like this, and it has buttons in different places on it. So you can also make it into a poncho and put buttons like on the end, so it creates a poncho. Or it's got buttons here where you can turn the ends up to make cuffs, and then buttons down the side here so it can be a shrug. Honeycomb, another pickup technique you can do on rigid heddle loom. And this one I think was in handwoven. I'm not sure. I'm never sure whether it was handwoven or Little Looms, both wonderful magazines. And I'm so happy Little Looms is going to be coming out 4 times a year now. Cool stuff. So honeycomb, and using a thicker yarn to accentuate the honeycomb cells. This is one, Fancy Finishes, also was in handwoven, I think. But I did this on the rigid heddle loom. I did this one on my 20-inch wide loom. I took advantage of a slow color change yarn to create the color change in the weft. And then this particular part right here was done on the loom, where you use a needle and wrap around bundles of warp thread. The twisted ends, when I took this piece off the loom, well, the theme for the magazine was fancy finishes. So I wanted to do some kind of really fabulous kind of thing. So I took bundles of warp threads and I just wrapped and wrapped and wrapped. And I got about a quarter of the way in. I know some of you can probably relate to this on projects that you do, but I got about a quarter of the way in, because each one has like over 100 wraps in it, you know, around and around the bundle of weft threads. And I thought, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? This is going to take me forever. So, and it did take a long time, but you know, the result is interesting. It's a fun kind of finish for the ends. Here's another project that's in my upcoming book, Fibonacci-based stripe in the warp, then using a very thin weft. So again, it's warp-faced and you get the stripe. But then I picked up along the edge, I hemmed this and then picked up along the edges and knitted a ribbing. And the ribbing is not necessarily exactly equal, but I did fat ribs in the middle, medium ribs, and then skinny ribs to try and emulate the stripe pattern in the weaving. This is a jacket. The panel on the edges is woven, goes over the shoulder, down the back, got tucks up here to kind of make it fit on the shoulder and also give room where you need more room. And then I picked up and knitted along the edge to make, this is garter stitch, knit up and around and until I got the width that I wanted, picked up and knitted on the sleeves. The back also has a knitted panel in the center, but I knitted that separately and then sewed it on with the sewing machine because I wanted a more crisp line where it's sewn on. a twisted shawl, a pattern that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and is always fun to weave. One long piece sewn together. This one was done on a 20-inch rigid heddle loom. This one is two 10-inch wide panels sewn together. So you can see right about along in here where the colors are different in the weft. This is a combination of the mohair silk yarn and a little bit thinner rayon yarn, or a little bit thicker rayon yarn. The solid color is the rayon, and the changey color is the silk mohair. And so again, stitched together, not matching, creates more interest, I think. And here you can see on the where it's sewn together here also. This was from a really long time ago, and a Stash Buster vest. It was, I think I have a note here, October of 2012 in Handwoven magazine. 3 panels sewn together. One, the shawl collar, one, actually it's 2 panels. One goes over the shoulder and is sewn down at the side, and then one is the shawl collar. So although I made the original one of these on a harnessed loom, this is something that can be easily woven on a rigid heddle loom. This is one of my favorites. Again, it's 3 panels sewn together. This one, I'm happy to say, was on the cover of Handwoven. Woohoo, what fun. Anyway, so it's 3 panels sewn together. You can kind of see the seam right here and here. Again, warp faced, because I used a very, very thin, narrow mohair silk yarn as the weft, because I wanted to accentuate the color changes. Another piece using very narrow panels, a kimono style vest. Again, this goes up and over the shoulder and down the back, a narrower panel in the center, and then using the same size panel as this kimono sleeves. And on this particular one, I sewed the panels together using the weft yarn so that the stitching is less visible. It kind of blends in. On this version, I used black to accentuate the stitching, and the seam becomes a design element. And then I crocheted along the front edge here with the black also, and did just a little loop of crochet to act as buttonholes. I taught on a cruise, and the woman who was in charge wanted a tropical looking piece with lots of fringe. And so I certainly gave her her wish on the lots of fringe. I've since taken, the fringe is too much for me personally. I've since taken this piece apart and put it back together without so much fringe on it. But this is also 2 panels. They're sewn together widthwise. So, I mean, horizontally. So here's the seam as it comes here. Just stitched together along the edge, right along in here. And then section as the sleeve, so the warp, the warp goes this way to allow it to have all that fringe.
When you're stitching these together, is this hand stitching, machine stitching, or does it depend on the project?
It depends on the project. This one was machine stitched together because this fabric was a little bit heavy. And, and since it goes around this way, I didn't want the stitching gapping here in the middle with my hand stitching. Most of them I sew together by hand, especially the ones that have the mohair in them, because it becomes invisible stitching.
So this is sort of a follow-up to that. So you may have already answered it, but we did have a request for you to talk about connecting techniques of the panels.
Yes, let me, let's go back one. So this one, you can see I butt the selvages up next to each other, and then I just do a whip stitch, but actually, yeah, a whip stitch back and forth. I don't know if you can kind of see that in the stitching. And because I did make this with the black yarn to accentuate it. Let's go back. I'll go back a few here on this one. this I use, so this has the silk mohair, which is a very lace weight kind of yarn, as the weft, and I use that to sew it together. So I butt the panels up next to each other. These are not overlapped. They're just laid down next to each other. And I catch the weft loop and the selvage thread on one side, and then catch the weft loop and the selvage thread on the next side, and then go back. So like I start on the right side, I catch the weft thread and the selvage loop, I catch the weft loop and the selvage thread on the left side, then bring the yarn over and go back through the right side again to the left side. The trick is don't pull too tight or you'll pucker. And make sure that you know you have it marked for your entire length before you start stitching, because you don't, although we think that we always beat consistently, you may have more weft picks on one side than you do on the other. So you want to make sure to ease those in. Like sometimes you may have to take 2 loops on one side, 2 weft loops on one side to go with 1 weft loop on the other side to make that all even out as you go along. I hope that helped.
Well, you're interrupted. Could you talk a little bit about selecting yarns? These unconventional yarns, are there things to look out for, or are there things to avoid, things to look for that are positive?
Let me, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me stop sharing and spotlight myself. Can I do that? No, okay. Anyway, so when let me go grab a ball of yarn. Okay. When I'm looking at a yarn, can you all see me? Am I visible here? Okay. So the thing I do, and I mean, it's mostly like for any weaving. I mean, I want to make sure, because knitting yarns, have some different characteristics. I always just bounce it, to make sure that it's not going to break. Okay. I just bounce it. And then I take my thumbnail against my index finger and I scrape along the weft to make sure that it's not going to shred. Because you can even use some singles, but if they're twisted enough that they won't shred, you can use them. The rigid heddle has those little sharp edges on it, on the holes and the slots. It's a corner and it's made out of plastic, so it's a hard edge. So if you scrape up and down, I mean, your heddle is going back and forth. So you want to make sure that you're not going to shred that yarn. And also then I'm going to go grab a heddle out of the closet. If I have a bumpy yarn, like with the bouquets or what in it, like some of those yarns where I said, I wouldn't use this on a floor loom, but I would use it on a rigid heddle loom. I thread the yarn through a hole in my reed, okay, or an eye, and I just rub it back and forth like this. I take it back and forth. If it holds up, then I can use it. Even if it has a bump in it, I can use it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. All right, good. I'll go back to sharing. Oh, except I guess I need where did my presentation go? Huh. Isn't that interesting? Okay, where's my keynote thingy? There we go. Okay, figured it out. All right, the pink thing. Okay, so this is another use of, this is one of my favorite pieces. I love this piece. And this was also one of the projects in my book that's coming out later this year. I had this old red sweater that I loved. It was a cotton sweater. I bought it at Costco. It was just one of those that I wore around the house all the time. But then I spilled bleach on it. And it got a couple of holes in it. So it was in the giveaway bag. And when I went to the thrift store, I just can't give this sweater away. So I kept it. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'll cut it up and make something out of it. So I steeped the front of it cut it apart, cut the front down because it was a pullover sweater, cut it down. I cut the sleeves off and I cut the bottom off where it had the bleach stain, you know, the resist, or, you know, I forget what you call that. The part, anyway, it was white. So I had this kind of vest thing, and I wove a panel that I used part of the fabric to sew around the bottom of the piece. So this is sewn on, machine stitched, okay? And then I took the rest of the panel and brought it up around the neck and back down the other side. And I also machine stitched that on. I crocheted the edges where I cut the sleeves off of the sweater. So that was a fun project, and I got to save my sweater from Costco, you know, which probably cost like $12 to start with anyway, but whatever. Anyway, and so then here's another version of it. This is a piece that I did. It's, I'm trying to think how many panels this is, 2 or 3 panels, woven on a 20-inch wide loom, sewn together to make this garment. You can wear it several different ways. But this was a fun project to do also. And I think this one is in the upcoming book as well. And here's one of the things that I love about the rigid heddle loom is using a variable dent reed. You can, on your reed, you can buy sections of the reed where you can have 2 or 4 inches be a 5 dent. And then the next 2 or 4 inches be a 15 dent. And so you can mix up the yarns that you use, the density of the yarns that you use, because your heddle will allow that. So this one again is 3 panels sewn together. The center panel is this wide section, and then the section on the sides with the really thick yarn in it. I used a 5 dent heddle for these, and I believe an 8 dent heddle for these. And then this is a 15 dent heddle, and maybe a 10 and an 8. So you can see you can really mix up the sections. This again is hand stitched together with the whip stitch using the mohair silk yarn that I like to use. And this is a close-up, so you can see how fine the weft is in this close-up picture. So that's a really wonderful thing that a rigid heddle offers, that it's difficult to do on a multi-harness loom, because although you can put, you know, a lot of threads through one wide dent, a lot of times they end up getting tangled or are hard to manage. And then this over here is an example of using the variable dent reed to not give pattern differences in the yarn, but structural difference in the yarn. I used about the same weight yarn in all 3 sections of this. The warp is going this way. So I wanted the bag to kind of stand up on its own. So this bottom dark green area is very densely set. I think it may be like 12 ends per inch. The middle section, I wanted to be a little more stable. So it's set at 12 ends. This one's 15, this one's 12. And this one I set at 8 because I wanted it to be flimsy enough to fold over to make the pocket for the drawstring. So the variable dent reed can be used in a couple of different ways, and some really, you know, different ways to use it and exciting ways to make your cloth. And then this is a top that I did that I love. This is woven on a 20-inch wide loom. The warp goes this way. It's a rayon fabric. And one of the things that was reinforced to me on this one was, you know, that you really always need to sample, because although I had made scarves out of this yarn before, I never really paid much attention to the shrinkage for making a scarf to sell. When I wove a sample for this before I made the garment, and it shrank 30%. So I was really happy that I had sampled. And that's the end of the talk. I'm going to stop sharing and just say a few things. First of all, are there any questions?
Yes, these variable dent reeds, where do you get them?
From anybody that sells the looms or, you know, manufactures the looms.
So I have an Ashford with rigid heddle. Do they make variable net reeds?
Yes.
Ashford?
What kind of loom? Oh, I mean, do you have a knitter's loom?
No, I have the next one up. I can't remember what it's called.
The rigid heddle or the sample it?
Rigid heddle.
Okay.
I don't remember it being.
Okay, they make 3 different models. One is just called the rigid heddle. One is called the sample it, and one is called the knitters.
I'm pretty sure I got the rigid heddle.
Okay. Yeah, you can get it from anybody that carries Ashford stuff.
Okay. All right.
They're pricey.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll warn you ahead of time. Like the one for the 12-inch, I think is about $90.
I tend to spend money on weaving stuff, so.
I totally can relate. Yes. And Rosalie, you had a question.
About Clasped Warp.
Uh-huh.
So I'm doing a project now with Clasped Warp, and one of the things I'd like to see happen is I'm coming from the peg with a color, I'm coming from the back of the loom with another color. What if I want to add a third color in the center? Is there a way to add a third color without a knot? Does this
You'd
make
have to
sense?
have a knot in there somewhere, or you'd have to have that third, you're talking about in the length of the piece.
Yes.
You'd have to have that color come from the peg to start with.
But then if I have some solid color going on down at the peg, if I have that other third color attached at the peg, it dilutes that band of solid color by having another thread in there. So I was trying to figure out if there's any way without a knot, because you'd have to have a loop, say, in the center. It would loop to the peg thread and it would loop to the back beam thread.
Well, the other thing you could do is just leave the tail hanging where you insert it in the center of the piece. Leave the tail hanging out and go back and needle weave it in, going the opposite direction that it went.
But then how do you keep tension if it's hanging?
You mean when you're weaving?
Well, when you're warping.
When you're warping. I would warp it over top of a table and put my glass on top of it, or put my tool bag on top of it so that holds it in place.
Okay, I'll have to figure out something, because I'm warping between a chair and the loom, so I'm in space.
Put a little portable table, or a chair or something in the center.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think you got the idea that I love the rigid heddle loom. You have a lot less loom waste, for one thing, because they're small. It allows you to use all those cool knitting yarns. And you can use the variable dent reed to get different kinds of things going on. I find the weaving is more immediate because it's closer to me, and I feel more of an intimacy with my loom when I'm using a rigid heddle loom. It's certainly portable, and warping is so easy. It's kind of unbelievable. So anyway, those are all the wonderful kinds of things that I love about the rigid heddle loom. And I think I mentioned I'm down to 1 floor loom now, which I find kind of unbelievable. From 9 to 1, it's amazing, isn't it? But thank you all for your attention. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to address them.
Okay, there was one more final question, which was about band weaving. I don't know, it just says, what about band weaving? But.
Yeah, I mean, you can do things like you can weave bands on a rigid heddle loom, but I haven't gone there, so I can't really speak to it.
And I have a question, which is, when is your book coming out?
Well, it's being published by Ashford, which I think is very, very cool. I'm very excited about that. And they're taking the pictures now. She keeps sending me pictures that not the pictures I showed you, which are, you know, my pictures, but really beautiful pictures that they're taking. They're projecting, you know, third to fourth quarter, but who
Great,
knows?
we'll look forward to it. And
Thanks. And yes, thank you, Rosalie and Virginia, both for showing up my book. I do have quite a few of those out at the studio. So if anybody is coming out May 1, 2, I'll be selling them at a bit of a discounted price. So that was a joy to write. It's all about, I mean, it's got all kinds of things in it, like kumihimo, needle weaving, ankle, I think it's, no, it doesn't have ankle, it's got tapestry weaving. It's just got a wealth of things, Dorset buttons. Yeah, thank you for showing it, you guys.
yeah, I mean, people have to have their screens so that, but that's called the Weaving Explorer, and go out and see
Also during
Deborah on the
COVID,
first
during
day,
COVID,
but if you're not, yeah.
it's there's all kinds of projects in here at all levels. And I did some things with my 5 and 3-year-old great niece and nephew. So, you know, it was fun. We did the stones. You go out and find stones in the yard and then wrap them. And so if any of you have youngins, it's really a fun book to do projects with them.
Yeah, I was thinking also every single section practically could be a great Weft
A workshop. Yeah, yeah.
or a regular workshop, depending on how complex it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I love doing the Dorset buttons at Weft.
Yeah, that was
a couple
really
of
good.
years ago, I think. Yeah.
So this book, you can, if you go on our website to our Amazon store and scroll down, you'll see it there, or you can get it directly from Deborah.
Yeah. And I hope you all come out to the studio May 1 and 2. We will, a lot of stuff will be outside, so you don't have to worry about being indoors as much. But I mean, I specialized in weaving with rayon chenille. So if anybody wants rayon chenille, I mean, I have really more than most stores do. I used to buy it in 500-pound lots, literally, and I did that a lot of times. So I have a huge selection, and I mean, other yarns as well, but I think rayon chenille now sells for like $35 a pound, and I'm selling it for $4. So if you ever think you might try it.
Yeah, I did visit that's where I got the book. I
Right.
did visit your studio when you had it open with the fall, I forget what it's called, but and I have to say, I resisted the temptation to buy yarn, but it is amazing, the yarns that Deborah has and the prices. So I would highly, and looms too. You have some looms for sale, right?
Yeah, I have a lot of looms.
Yeah.
I sold I sold the floor looms and the table looms, but I have a lot of rigid heddle looms. I was scheduled to teach at 3 conferences last spring, and at ones where I needed to provide the looms and people would be able to buy them from me after class. And so I had just purchased like 30 new rigid heddle looms, and my husband had put them together, and then all the conferences got canceled. So I have a lot of rigid heddle looms.
So this is a chance to get a loom that you don't have to put together yourself.
And at 25% off, which is a really good deal. So anyway,
and her studio is in a super fun part of Camarillo on the main street. So you go there, shop, and then go have lunch at one of the great little restaurants right there.
And it's an art center. So on Saturday, a few of the other artists will have their studios open. So I know there's a ceramic artist that's going to have her studio open. So, I mean, all of it with social distancing, and everybody has to wear a mask, of course. So come on out.
And again, Deborah, what are the hours on the 1st and 2nd?
10 to 4 both days.
Okay, great.
And if you can't make it, then email me, because I'll be there the week before that. So I feel like a salesperson. I'm sorry.
Well, we're encouraging you. All right. Well, thank you very much, Deborah. And I'm sure the participants who will be in the workshop this afternoon are very much looking forward to it, but they need a little lunch break. So we will now adjourn. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Thanks for having me. I'll see some of you later.